Hi, I'm Greg Farrar. It is July 26th, 2020. This is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. I'm again wearing my fabulous pink tortoiseshell glasses because otherwise I can't read my own graphs. And I have not gotten my prescription again. So, hope you enjoy them and this. Let's dive right into it. At the country's level, so I fairly recently, in the past week or two, have started talking about severity, which is a metric that I use to try to represent how bad it is broadly. It encapsulates two concepts: one being how many cases are there adjusted for population, and secondly, how fast is the daily case rate growing? How many cases are there per day? So, for instance, something like New York, super high in total number of cases, but it's dropped off a lot in its growth rate. Well, actually, its growth rate varies a little bit, but its cases are so low now that it doesn't show up as in a top. In this case, maybe Italy is a better example. Italy doesn't show up in a severity report, the top 20 severity, because its cases are low. Once the cases get very low, you do see a lot of fluctuation where it may grow 10% a day or drop 10% a day, because we're talking it goes from 10 cases to 11 or 11 to 10. But those growth rates can seem very high, but this severity attempts to compensate for that by also including the daily cases per million, and the other direction as well. If you have a very low growth rate, like a negative 90% a day, but you have a lot of cases, that's considered a fairly good thing. Yes, you have a lot of cases, but see how fast they're shrinking, and so that also pushes down the severity. I've made, however, a change in how I calculate severity. Originally, I was just multiplying the ratio, weekly growth ratio, 1.1 meaning a 10% weekly growth, 1.4 being a 40% weekly growth. I was multiplying that by the daily cases per million. I didn't feel like that was including growth enough in this number, so now I'm squaring the ratio. So it's daily cases per million times the growth rate ratio squared. So a growth rate of, for instance, 100% or 2.0, a doubling of growth every day will now show up as a 4 times multiplier, whereas a 1.0 will show up just as a 1 times multiplier, and a 50%, a 0.5, a 50% reduction will show up as a 1/4 multiplier, 0.25 multiplier. So bottom line is extreme growth gets really pushed to the top, and very small growth gets pushed to the bottom, a lot harder than it was a few days ago, or a week ago when I first invented this metric. This manifests itself in Kyrgyzstan, which has actually a large number of cases, but also a large growth rate. And Kyrgyzstan is showing this extraordinarily high number now of 2,000 severity. Even Qatar never reached 2,000, but here's Kyrgyzstan at 2,000. This will probably flatten out a little bit. It is a moving average, so I don't know if the spike will stay there. Actually, the spike probably will stay there. This is probably just an anomaly. I went looking a little bit into Kyrgyzstan and found one of these cases like we had back in February in China, where they changed the way they reported things. Much in the same way that China changed the way they reported things in February, they went from saying something's only a case if it's confirmed to be a case with a test, to saying something's a case if it really looks like a case, if the lungs show the patterns of being a case, or maybe even if other symptoms are aligned. So Kyrgyzstan, I think, suddenly threw every case that it ever had that it hadn't officially called a case into this one day and said, yeah, okay, all these 10,000 cases we're now going to say they were really COVID-19. We didn't say they were, but now we think they were, and or I guess they were the virus of COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, something like that. So this probably is not super significant. I might even chop it out in days to come because it does interfere with our looking at the rest of the graph. But let's look at the rest of the graph, ignoring Kyrgyzstan. So we see, as before, well, let's take the very far out view. The far out view is kind of bad news. These countries, roughly over the past month or so, are growing. We didn't have that many cases except for our few really extreme, Qatar, Bahrain, and I guess Kuwait. I vaguely remember that. We had some really extreme severities back in the day. Those have recovered, but the ones that were low now have generally gone up. And so we're seeing, I would say, we've seen a general rise in severity. The top 20 now, the lowest of top 20 is a 95 in severity, which is a severity warm spot. Whereas back in the day, there were lots of lower ones. We didn't have as many severe countries. I guess another way of saying is just we have more severe countries, severely hit countries, than we used to. And that seems to indicate an upwards trend. On the other hand, if you look at the most severely hit ones, ignoring, let's just take it out, Kyrgyzstan, you can see the 5 worst ones are still showing this nice short-term, not very reliable trend over the past week where they're dropping in severity. So these 5 worst countries dropping in severity, getting better. Meanwhile, most of the rest are slightly upwards, I'd say on average. Some of them are a little bit harder upwards, like Colombia, though it's looking like it maybe is starting to peak. It's had a little bit of a burst compared to the rest of them. We'll zoom in just to take one more close look, and you can see most of the smallest countries, well, actually many of those became the big ones and have then recovered, but the best of the top 20, in other words, the least severe of the top 20 most severe countries, are still pretty severe. 100 is warm spot, and all 20 of these are pretty severe. We will probably reach a point at some point, I hope, where all of them will be under 100, where the most severe countries will be under 100, or at least most of them will be, but we're not there yet. We still have a lot of severity in the world right now. And if we look at the total picture, it's hard to see, which is why I don't use this graph much, but we can see there are, when you look at all countries, there are a lot that aren't very hard hit. There are a whole bunch of countries down here in the under 100, but then we still have these 20 or 30 countries that are hard hit. And though again, the worst ones are recovering. Oman, Bahrain, Israel, South Africa, and Panama, and I guess the United States, worth noting. The United States, I didn't even see that in this graph, but yeah, there's the United States. I think last time I did this live stream, these 5 were starting to recover, but the United States wasn't. But look, the United States is curving down, even in daily cases. The United States at the moment is showing a short-term, so far, drop in daily cases. And this points towards the possibility of the United States has actually reached its new peak. There was a peak back in early April, and then it just declined for a while. Then from there, got better, and now then there's been this new peak when all these other states have come online. Almost all the rest of the states really that weren't hit back in early April have now gotten the epidemic. But here we see the United States, which was at a severity of 265, has now dropped to 252. Now 200 is a hot spot, so the United States is still a hot spot. It is still among the major severely hit countries of the world, but like the worst ones here, it has started to turn downwards, started to improve, started to see fewer and fewer, well, it's not necessarily daily cases, because again, this combines things. This is, it's the daily cases and the growth rate combined. Let's just zoom in on the United States for a minute and see why is it declining? Because there are 2 reasons the severity can decline. The severity can decline because the number of daily cases declines while the growth rate stays stable, or it can decline because the growth rate declines while the number of cases stays stable, and those 2 can interact. So if they both decline, then it declines that much faster. But if I go back to my legend here, let's look at daily cases per million for the United States alone. You can see the United States is not yet declining in daily cases. And since the severity is declining, that can only mean that its growth rate is declining. And you can really see that now in this graph. It's still a little too short term to make any sort of a firm guess about what's going to happen, but it's starting to look just like it did back in early April, where this line headed sharply upwards started to level off, and eventually actually peaked and declined. And we're seeing this rising, leveling off, not yet peaked. There's certainly not a peak here, not an obvious peak, though. I don't think it would be surprising if it turned out that today was the peak of the United States, given this graph. If it headed downward from here, that wouldn't be anomalous in the trajectory it's been following so far. But we certainly see a curving towards the horizontal on the United States graph. But the really interesting one then is bound to be the growth graph. We've seen for some time that the United States is showing a good direction in its growth graph. It's not yet shrinking in cases, but it's showing this nice downward trend in its growth graph. So where on July 5th, the new cases in the United States were growing by 36% a day, a very high number. That's 40% I think of as, we see higher than that for sure, but 40% is really bad. The United States was doing 36%. That's back when Arizona and Florida were really flaring up. Those have gotten quite a bit better, as we'll see in the next segment, which probably is a big part of why this has gotten better. But as the United States progresses to now, we see that at this point, it's down to only 12% growth. That's what was it, 36? Yeah. So that's an even 3 times reduction in its growth rate. And so if it continues for about half that long, how long has this been? This was July 25th, 5th to 25th. So 20 days it took to go from 36 down to 12. So it'll take another 10 days if this line keeps going straight, and it certainly has been straight for a while now. If it continues to be straight, another 10 days will reach the peak of daily cases in the United States, at least for this moment. Now we've seen before there's only, it doesn't go far enough back, does it? Okay, this doesn't, the growth this was back in early April when it was first coming into its first epidemic. Let me go back to the one what I'm trying to say is that in the cases per million graph, we have seen this before, and it's totally possible that it will peak and drop away, and then peak again, and we'll have some new peak at 400. I don't know. So we're not out of the woods, and we'll never actually probably be completely out of the woods when it comes to this pandemic. But at least we're not in this sort of a place anymore. The July 7th period or the April 1st period where it was looking very bad, where the cases were rising and even accelerating. At this point, there was actually an acceleration from March into April as the cases started going faster and faster, and the growth rate was rising. Now the growth rate's falling in the United States, is looking not peaked, certainly not recovered, but showing that consistent trend toward recovery, towards the place where the daily cases will peak. Let's take another look at that graph and just see. Yeah, so there was a time when the United States had a negative growth rate. That was when that line was dropping after the April peak. And now then it rose and rose and rose, got quite bad, and is declining in another 10 days. May show us a peak for the United States. And we'll get into the next section about what that peak would look like, state by state. Okay, so severity, though, broadly, we have a lot of countries still rising, a lot of countries still severe, but there are these 6 or 7, if you count Kyrgyzstan, I think. What was it? Oh yeah, Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan also is sharply dropping. But again, that's probably just an anomaly of the data. What shall we look at here otherwise? Maybe just take a quick look at worldwide testing. I haven't looked at this for a while. Daily population tested by country. Just to see if we get anything interesting here. What we've always seen when we look at this graph is everything is rising. But you know, it's not so much true anymore. We're seeing first of all, I just think we don't have testing data for a lot of countries. This is I know this is just the top 25, but among the top 25, probably top 25 hottest in daily cases per million, several of them have leveled off. Russia, Qatar, for instance, they're doing 15 or 0.15, 0.2 of the percent population tested per day, which these are good numbers, but they're also flat. Whereas other places like Italy, you can see this is where we see the immune system of a region dropping away, where Italy tested their way out of it, locked their way out of it, and now they're kind of done. If we actually were to look at Italy, maybe we'll take just a moment because we do have that graph here. We can see Italy got over it, and now they're testing fewer and fewer. Now, why is that? Maybe it's just because fewer and fewer people have symptoms, but also I think there's a tendency once a region gets over it for a long enough time for them to get complacent. And so I fear that Italy may have another wave coming one of these days. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I wanted to do daily cases per million. Yes. Let's look at Italy. It's certainly not going to be in one of the, well, that's weird. My graph is completely blank. I may not be able to do this. I'll try reloading the page. I have not seen that problem before. The all countries graph of daily cases per million is just missing. I have had some problems with this website. For instance, the way everything is left aligned, but haven't seen that problem. All right, it's back. Let's just look at Italy though in daily cases per million, and just also we'll look at its growth graph because I think it's worth thinking about because the growth it will emphasize why I do severity as a metric. So, daily cases per million, Italy again never reached warm spot territory. You wouldn't have known it from the news coverage at the time. But that's just because the news coverage hadn't seen anything yet. Everyone thought Italy had it terrible, but here it is, peaking below 90. And remember, the United States is at 200 or something right now, so twice as bad as Italy even now. But Italy just has this perfect little curve here. They peaked, they locked down, they got over it, recovered for whatever reason, and now they're down at 3.5, which is nothing. Their daily cases per million are very, very low. But if you look at the growth chart, I'm guessing we're going to see a story that might, if you only had the growth chart, you might get worried about old Italy. Let's see Italy's growth chart. Yeah, okay, not too worrisome, but in recent weeks, you might look at this and say, oh no, here's Italy growing again. And yes, Italy is indeed growing again after a long period of negative 10% of daily growth, daily cases growth. It's now up to almost 5% of daily cases growth. But remember, it's at 3.5, I think it was, in daily cases per million. It's very low in daily cases per million. And what we see is that once the daily cases per million gets small enough, this tends to fluctuate around the zero line. It can go to 10% for a day or 5% per day. And that's just because there will be a day where we had 10 cases, and then a day we had 11 cases, and that's a 10% growth. And then the next day you have 10 cases, it's a negative 10% growth. Or average that over a week. There's a little bit of random fluctuation that happens when the numbers get small. So this graph, it actually is not too far from representing what really happened in Italy. Italy's not Israel, Italy. Italy is really does have this very nice recovery graph in growth, just saying that it dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped, and it just kept dropping. But then there's this tail here that you could get worried about, but I'm sure not going to at 3 to 5 daily cases per million. Nothing to worry about in Italy. There was an article I saw somewhere that I'd like to briefly talk about, which was saying here are all these countries that thought they'd gotten over it and now they haven't. Now things are terrible again. And I have a feeling Italy is going to be on their list. I think this article is just missing the point, and I've already kind of said why. But let's look at another one of the ones they talked about. I think they talked about Japan. Yeah, maybe Japan. And if you look at Japan, now maybe I may end up just making a fool of myself here, but I'm used to it. My theory here is, and we'll go back and find out, on the other graph is that Japan has these wild waves, like, oh no, we have 75% weekly growth day over day or week over week in Japan. Isn't that terrible? Yes, that is a terrible growth number. And I think somebody who wrote that article had an idea that they were going to figure out which countries had done well and are now doing terribly. And they found Japan. They looked at the graph and said, there you go, there's one for my article. But if Japan doesn't have any cases to speak of, this is completely irrelevant. Who cares if you had 10 cases yesterday and 18 now? So let's find out what Japan has in daily cases per million. And this is why I adjust for population also, so we really can compare. Okay, so Italy's up right now, but we can go straight over to Japan. So, see again, you look at this graph and you say, oh no, Japan is doing terribly. Until you look at the scale and realize Japan had 1 daily case per million. They shot up to 4. They recovered down to 1, and now they've shot up to 4.5. And I'm pretty sure Japan was in this article as one of the countries that was really bad, or they got over it, or they thought they got over it, and now things are terrible. Now, yes, if this graph continues for weeks and weeks, Japan could become problematic. 80% growth every week, and double every week. We could see 8 and then 16 and 32 and 64, and then suddenly you're a warm spot. So, but it will take a long time, and as we saw here, if you see a spike, and it often just declines, and we may very well see this spike decline as well. So beware articles that point to countries that aren't hotspots and say they're having terrible problems. Another one was Australia, I think. Australia, very much the same story. Very much the same story. Australia has been essentially at 0. They had a very, very small peak, very small problem. 14 daily cases per million is nothing. We've seen 1,000. And it takes 100 before I even start paying attention to them usually. So 14 is Australia never got hard hit. They recovered even from that small spike, and they were fine for weeks and weeks. And yes, now they're showing a rise. But even now, they're barely above 10. It's just nothing to worry about. If we were to look at the growth graph, I'm sure it would say it's growing terribly fast. But when the daily cases are small, the prospect of high growth is not a serious imminent problem. So let's look at Australia, remembering that we have all these things in the severity in the 500, 100, 500, and a few in the thousands. What is Australia, given that many countries are over 100, and those are the ones that I think are really problematic? Australia is at 20. So, not yet time to worry about Australia. They might be the next wave. They certainly should take action to make sure that they don't have a new wave of it, but actually they may already have done that, because we see this has risen a bit. Actually, there's just no data for a long time. I think what happened is they had 0 cases. I believe they had no cases at all for a long time, and so this graph just draws a straight line, and now they've finally gotten a few cases, or a lot of cases. 10, 20, I don't know how many they have. What they have is, what did we see? I forget, but 12 daily cases per million. So you multiply that by this whole country of many, many million, and you find it's a lot of cases they've got. I'll find out how many. What's the population of Australia? I'm just going to say it's like 100 million. No, 25 million. So at 25 million, was it 12 daily cases per million? Maybe 25 times 12 is how many cases they've got in that case, so it's 300. So yes, they have a pocket of cases. Often when this happens, it's all in one homeless camp, or it's all in one prison, or it's all in one military base, and so it really doesn't spread. But we'll see. We'll watch Australia. Anyway, that's enough for the countries. The broad answer then remains the status of the countries. There are some bad ones. There are quite a few bad ones. But the worst ones are getting better, and the middle ones are getting worse. So mixed bag for the countries. Oh, I do want to take at least a quick peek at the worldwide daily cases, though, because this is fun. Well, not that one. Worldwide, yeah, this one. I don't think I have this in my new background arrangement, but I'll just say we still have what appears to be a downward trend in world cases. In the growth rate of world cases. World cases are rising, as other places, but we have this leading indicator that I tend to harp on, which is the growth rate. And the growth rate, the world was growing at 1.5% per day. Not a huge growth rate, but warm. And now it's at 1.2% per day. And it's steadily gone downward in this very latest day, which is, I think, an average of 7 days, actually. So somewhat substantial, somewhat believable, 0.5%. So the world is starting, after a long plateau, appears to be starting a trend towards zero growth, which at this rate would take forever. But if this point is any indicator, maybe we're going to start to see some lower cases. But in any case, at least it's not rising in the way that it used to be. The world cases are still rising, but the rate at which they're rising is starting to shrink. So that's a little bit of indication of good news for the world. Oh, actually, I already have this baked here, another tab. So states, moving on to the states. Severity. All right, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I think, there we go. So the severity graph. What to make of this severity graph? It's like the countries, it's kind of a mixed bag. Certainly, if you compare severity now to how it was in late May, things are terrible. Our 20 worst, though actually that's interesting. I should probably look on the other graph. I just realized these are the current 20 worst as they were back in May. So the ones that are worst now were very good or fairly good back in May. But did we have other ones back in May that were really terrible? Well, yeah, we had, I guess, Indiana and Rhode Island and Nebraska and quite a lot of other ones that were bad back in May that maybe aren't so bad now. But there still is kind of this bottleneck here in May when you look at all the states where there was nobody who was above 200. Highest one was Maryland, I guess, at 166 in severity back in late May. But now you look at it, and there are all these severe states. So the big picture still is bad. We have a lot of states that are much more severe. Several of them are above 500, much more severe than they were at their best back in the day, in May. On the other hand, if you look at the short-term picture, many of these states were a lot worse just a few weeks ago. And the ones that have really been making the news, let's just pick them out here. What's it going to be? Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. No, not Texas. Texas is interesting in its own right, but let's look at Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. Right? Why not? So I'll throw in Louisiana there too, because they've sort of been on the news. I kind of thought these would be. Oh wait, no, they're not, because these are ones that are recovered. That's why I can't find them near the top of this list, is because they're no longer severe, or they are severe, but they're not as severe. Florida, Georgia, and Arizona, and throw in Louisiana, which is not quite, doesn't show this trend quite as strongly. So these three states that were really bad in early July, that's just weeks ago, now have plummeted. But they've plummeted to a place that's still very severe. They still have a very severe problem in the 300s that makes them hot spots. Until they drop below 200, they're still hot spots. But they were a whole lot worse a few weeks ago. And somewhat the same with Louisiana. Louisiana suddenly took off and was looking terrible, but and it is terrible. It's peaked at 700, and even now it's above 600. But there is a trend. Short-term trend, can't believe those as much as the long-term ones, and any of these can always fling themselves back in any direction. You see, for instance, a little hook on Georgia here that could indicate a new rising trend, but my guess is that the general trends will be downward for all of these going forward, because that's what states do. And again, I will return to the trajectories graph, which is gives quite a different view of what happens, showing every state that's ever hit 100, when they hit 100, and by the way, look at all the states that have hit 100 now. That is almost all of them. Almost all the states have, at some point in their history, become warm spots in daily cases per million, 100 daily cases per million. Back in the day, a few months ago, this graph would have been almost empty. There was almost nobody who hit 100. Though one of them was Louisiana. Now, if we look at Louisiana, the daily cases aren't dropping yet, and since we saw the severity is dropping, that suggests that the growth rate must be dropping. If we focus on Louisiana alone, we can see it had a brief peak into hotspot territory and then seemed to recover, but never really did, never got very far below 100. And we've seen a few examples now that if you don't get all the way down, like Italy has, then there's the possibility of a real comeback. So Louisiana has always been this exception to the idea that states rise, peak in 30 days, fall down in another 40 days, so at the 70-day mark, and never come back. But it is at this point still pretty much the only exception to that, and you can see this by squinting. You can see this by noticing that the graph starts all at 100. They get very wide around 30, and then it just narrows down to the right, which means that as a whole, on the whole, states do recover, certainly to below hotspot territory, even if they were hot at 30 or 40 days out, as many of them were, a lot of hot states. All the ones that we've had a chance to watch into the 70 range have recovered from that hotspotness down into really in almost all cases into not even being warm anymore at 60 days. So when you look at Arizona or Florida, you can see these are following the example. Here's New Jersey, the dotted green line, doing exactly that. And New Jersey is one of the very oldest ones. We really get to see that one and how it recovered. You get to see the whole trajectory of New Jersey's recovery is following that typical trajectory of a state. New York, same thing. Peaks in about 30 days, recovers in about 60. I don't know, Michigan probably. I feel like I go through these a lot because this is kind of the point, my main point. Yeah, Michigan followed its own trajectory, never got it very bad, recovered in 20 days, and so far has stayed pretty well in the low zone, though never down into the teens or anything. So maybe Michigan, you can see a rise here. Maybe Michigan will become a new Louisiana. Other things that might have Iowa, for instance, is one that also followed its own trajectory. Also peaked and recovered quickly. I almost want to say too quickly. Like if you don't let the thing run its full 60-day cycle, then it comes back. So maybe we have a new 60-day cycle for Iowa starting here at day 50-something. And maybe Iowa, which is now 30 days in to its new cycle, maybe that's peaking, and maybe we'll see in another 40 days Iowa will recover and stay there. We'll see. Anyway, if we look at the trajectories report, we can see that there are some states that we can't yet determine whether they're going to follow the trajectory because we haven't had enough time. South Carolina, for instance, certainly peaking and sort of flattening out around the 30 or 40 day mark. Alabama as well. Arguably starting to turn down, but we'll see. Alabama is bucking the trend a little there. And then we have someone like Mississippi. Mississippi started kind of late. It's almost like I want to do something where, like with Iowa, where if I could adjust this graph so that it won't consider that Mississippi has really started until it hits hits 100 and then hits 200. I don't know. Maybe I should do it when they hit 200. But Mississippi hovered here for a while, and so in some sense then the beginning of its 30-day cycle is more obviously around around day 22 there, and in that sense it hasn't quite broken the trend yet. But anyway, what we certainly do see is a trend towards most states to recover and stay recovered here out but beyond the 60 mark. That's what's happened with most of them, but not all. Okay, so this is daily cases per million. I wanna still hang out on severity. So, as with the countries, then the most severe states are showing a trend towards recovery. Now, maybe this is just what they call regression toward the mean among the statistically savvy, which is to say the worst things tend to get better and the best things tend to get worse. Everyone heads towards the average. So maybe that's all that's happening here. But I think that this is because of the trajectory graph we saw. I think this is more than that, or rather the trajectory graph is itself tied to regression to the mean in some deep mathematical way, which is to say when countries take off, they do peak at 30 because they tend to regress to the mean and they head back down. Those countries that weren't hardest hit, though, those states that weren't hardest hit, are not clearly getting better at this point. We have a lot of states. There are about 5 that were clearly doing a lot better, and those are the 5 that were the worst a few weeks ago. And then we have the other 15 here, just to take a kind of normal example in Arkansas. Actually, Arkansas is one of the Gang of 6, so maybe I'll talk about them a little bit later. Arkansas, still gradually getting a little bit worse. But it did show a trend towards recovery for a bit, or at least it looked bad and it got worse and then it seemed to get better. Arkansas may be doing a little worse now, and we see this in a lot of states. There are a lot of states that are just doing a little bit worse. California may be showing a hook towards improvement. We'll see more in this next section. South Carolina, also showing a little bit of improvement. Those are some of more of the Gang of 6. But Tennessee is a more typical one. A lot of states were doing quite well in May and have accelerated and are continuing upwards in the long view. Sure, we can say Tennessee is flattening out, but the big picture is that it's been heading upwards. It wouldn't surprise me at all if it heads downward now. That would certainly be in keeping with the typical trajectory, but we're not seeing it yet. And so that's what we're seeing in a lot of places, this sense that they haven't quite turned the corner towards recovery in their severity. A lot of states kind of doing this thing, and I guess that's not, it could be worse. They could be shooting upwards like Louisiana once did, and instead there's just a lot of kind of holding steady. So in severity, the worst ones are getting better, all the rest are holding steady, or some of them are getting worse. Let's see what else we have to look at here. Let's take a moment to look at this graph that I always look at, just to give us another sense of how things tend to go. The rope chart of the Gang of 6. The Gang of 6 were very hard hit: Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, North and South Carolina, and Utah. They were the worst hit of about 2 months ago. Now, if you look at the Gang of 6, we see they continue their trend towards recovery. You would have thought these were really going somewhere. And I mean, Arizona did. Arizona really did go somewhere. But look at it now. Arizona was terrible, but as we've seen, it's one of the best states now in its growth rate. And it's actually trending downward very quickly in a way that may take it off the map entirely in a matter of days. Here it is, 2% drop in daily cases every day, fewer and fewer cases, and also it seems to be bending downward as though accelerating. So Arizona looking quite good. Its latest day, 3% drop in daily cases. And then we look at these two, Utah and North Carolina, both way below 1% in growth, both trending downwards. None of the other 5 have quite broken that zero line to say that they've peaked and are dropping, but they're really headed that way. South Carolina even more strongly. South Carolina essentially at 0 today. South Carolina turning the corner around today towards negative growth. And then we have Arkansas. No, actually that's Alabama. Maybe Alabama was. I don't remember. One of these Gang of 6 was not behaving. I guess it probably was Alabama. You can see a lot of very high days for Alabama. But Alabama finally seeing some good days. Finally seeing on its most recent day, I think this is. Alabama is showing a negative growth rate several of its most recent days. Unfortunately, Utah is the same color, so I have to pick them out. I really should redo this. Well, I can redo this. Let's take a look at this in here. It'll be wigglier, but we'll at least be able to tell the colors apart. We'll be able to get a more of a sense of what the short-term trends are looking like for the Gang of Six. So certainly there's a sense, if you squint, that things are turning downward. Alabama here, pretty steady, pretty much a plateau, maybe a little hook downwards, but mostly a plateau. It's actually been, it's weird. No, that's not. I thought I was seeing it as though it were starting with a very, very big wave and then getting lower and lower, but I'm mixing up Alabama and Arkansas, which was doing that earlier. So Alabama's the worst, but not terrible. At least it's holding steady. Its growth rate at 30% is not great, not good even, but 40 is where things are really alarming, and you can see all of the 40s are now in the past. Many of these, I'd say, broadly, everyone's below 10. If you look at North Carolina, you could argue that it's flattened out and is not dropping, but it's at least flattened out at 10. Utah also maybe flattened out, but it's clear that South Carolina is doing well and that Arizona are doing well. South Carolina may need a couple more days before it hits 0. But the Gang of Six certainly looking better than they used to, trending downward in growth. And this is what we see with states as a whole. I'm kind of running out of time here, so I wonder what else I can look at. I'll just take a quick look at the severity of some of the other states of interest. I really could just do this as nothing but severity. I wouldn't feel too bad if all I ever presented was a severity chart, because I'm pretty comfortable now that this is a real metric and shows interesting, useful things that really can't be pulled out of either of the other two charts I typically show, daily cases per million and simple growth. Okay, so let's just look at some of our favorite states. These are our favorite states because they are the states where our listeners live. But in the severity department, the only good one here is Colorado. Colorado is it's been showing a little bit of upward trend, but I'm not too worried. It's warm, but certainly it's better than most. If everyone else were below 100, I guess I'd be saying Colorado's warm and that it's worse than everyone else, but it's in such bad company that Colorado's looking like the golden boy of this pack. Louisiana had a real problem, probably getting better now. Georgia had a real problem, definitely getting better now. With a little hook here again suggests maybe that won't persist, but I'm kind of guessing it will. Texas, kind of holding steady at a pretty unfortunate 500 here. Texas is, in some sense, the worst of all of these, even though it's a little less severe than Louisiana. It shows less of a trend towards recovery. But at least it's not doing this anymore. That diagonal sharp upward line. And then finally, California, looking pretty bad, 300, not a good number. Severity hotspot, but at least showing a slight trend towards recovery in severity. I think I will focus on California. Hopefully I haven't already done this and just forgot that I did, but I don't remember talking about California in detail today, so let's just look at the other two graphs for California. Where is California? Well, it's hot, above 200 in daily cases per million. Shows a little sign of a plateau, but mostly just not looking good in daily cases per million. The numbers have been rising, and this little wiggle doesn't mean much. But if we look at the growth rate of California, California is looking quite good in its growth chart, at least in the short term. Certainly in the long term it's flat, I'd say, flat around 15%, which is a mediocre growth. We don't want to have 15% growth, but it's low again compared to the company it's in. It is growing, does have a 12% growth still, but it was 30% just a couple weeks ago. And so California seems to be trending downward in a good direction. We'll see it could totally, it was doing this here, and it was kind of doing it here, and in both cases it turned back around. But right now California is doing some things to try to lock down more, and I think people are a little bit more afraid, and I think fear is an excellent source of negative growth. So California, I could almost make, like they have in the stock market, they have the fear index. I could almost make a fear index, which is based on the growth rate. When people get afraid, they do the things that drives the growth down. And so California's fear was at I'd say almost an all-time high a couple weeks ago. There is always this beginning when the epidemic's first ramping up. But if this is the fear graph, then California it's less afraid, which is a problem because it's not done yet. But what we tend to see is that the fear level propagates forward a couple weeks. So when you have a couple weeks like this and the news is really bad, people get afraid and they start doing the stuff, and that drives a downward trend of a couple weeks in the fear graph. So with any luck, California is going to hit zero growth in just a matter of weeks from the direction this latest trend is going. But I certainly can't predict that. I can just say the short-term trend indicates it. California has always lived kind of in a world of its own when it comes to this graph, just like the United States lives in a world of its own when it comes to its graph. And I think, as I've suggested before, it's because California is actually several states, just like the United States is actually several countries. And so they move independently. All right, so let's move on to California. I'm not doing much looking at testing lately, just because I seem to take up there's so much happening on the severity front that I can take my entire 50 minutes, 50, that I try to make this fit into. If it were really going to be 50, I've only got 4 minutes left, so I'll probably extend this one a little bit. But let's look at the county's severity. All right, so wild stuff happening in the counties of California. Severity here. Let me just make sure of one thing before I do this, that I actually have reloaded this. The 26, yeah, this is today's data. Briefly, my severity numbers were whacked, and I'm not going to go into why, but I fixed them because I was seeing graphs like this, and I was saying, wow. And it turned out that I was over-accounting for growth in my attempt to account for growth. But these are sort of real, I think. Sort of real. Let's get a sense of why. And Kern at 2,500 severity, it's just so far ahead of the pack. And we saw Stanislaus as well, was there, but then sharply has recovered down to a miserable 600. But Marin also was doing well for a while. It showed a peak, and then it seems to have just completely lost it. So what is happening to these two counties? I will just say the rest of the counties are looking pretty bad as well. The very best one is of the top 20 is at 200, so these are all hot spots. Every single one of them is a hot spot in severity. But I want to take a little bit of a dive into Marin and Kern. So in daily cases per million, I think I am going to get rid of these blue things because all I ever do is swing right past them and ignore them. Kern, actually I probably don't even need to. Oh, I guess we don't have a top 20 here, do we? That's interesting. I thought I made one. Whatever. So daily cases per million. The short answer here, and this is the most, I don't know, gritty of the numbers. It's closest to the reality. When I look at the growth rate, that's sort of one derivative removed from reality. And when I look at the severity rate, that's a sort of manufactured metric that also doesn't correspond to anything in the real world. I still like those because the growth rate shows something about what's coming up, and the severity gives a better sense of how bad things are overall. But this is real. This is daily cases per million. This is actual cases on the ground, number of cases. Kern back in April, early May, had 25 daily cases per million, just not even on the radar. It showed a little bit of growth, and now suddenly, and this is many days that have shown this spike. This isn't, though this is a moving average, so probably there was one extreme spike that's pulling this upwards. Kern has reported rising numbers of cases, and probably is going to continue to report rising numbers of cases, probably due to some particular spike. I don't know what it is, but these are the actual cases reported by Kern. I'll probably have to look into this now in the way that I looked into Imperial and said, oh, that's because it's got the Mexicali problem with all the cases coming from Mexico. And I think, what was it, Kings maybe was where there was a prison outbreak. Don't know what's happening in Kern, but something really dramatic is happening to the total cases they're reporting. If we look at actually while we're there, let's go back there and look at the other one. What was it? Kern and Marin. If we look at the cases in Marin, nope. I need to use my table of contents, I guess. Yeah, Marin's even worse. It's claiming 700 daily cases per million suddenly. Maybe this is just a data anomaly. I guess I should look into these more because these are really extreme numbers. So let's just move on and say yes, the data coming from there do say that there's a problem, but it's so extreme we're gonna ignore them for the moment. And Stanislaus as well. The smaller you get at the county level, the more possibility there is of having really wild numbers that are either simply errors in the data or something more on the lines of there aren't very many cases. In this case, it's not that there aren't many cases, because that's what we just saw. The cases are rising. But let's look at the rest. So whether those are serious problems, I can't say for sure. But the data suggests that they are, but it could be just a blip. When we look at the more normal counties, we can just see all of these counties are showing high severity. They're all hotspots. Orange stands out for me as a clearly recovering one in severity. Monterey also clearly recovering, and several others. San Joaquin clearly recovering. I think we'll see these then in the growth chart as well, probably. But the rest, overall, California up, mostly rising still in severity. Maybe a little bit of horizontalness in all these numbers. A number that are, I didn't mention San Benito as well, also showing a downward trend. So there are a lot of these that are showing a downward trend in severity, but they're still all very severe. They haven't trended so far downward that they're not severe anymore. Let's look at the total numbers here for the whole state. See if we can see anything if we look at it. Yeah, it's hard to say. Hard to say even when you squint. I can say that in the whole state, there are very few counties that aren't even warm spots. Humboldt, Shasta, Lake, Nevada. Don't know how to pronounce that one. I need to look it up. Tuolumne, El Dorado. Those are the best right now, but in some of them, like Humboldt, is doing very well at 28 daily cases per million. But the whole rest of the state is a tangle of hot spot, warm spot in severity. Now, just to see, let's look at the growth, just because I think this may be our hope. Growth has lately been a fairly happy report for us. Now, Marin and Kern, we still show these extremely high growth rates, but ignoring those because we don't know how real they are. Stanislaus did something similar and quickly recovered. This kind of a sharp peak suggests this is a moving average, so it suggests a single day that was extraordinarily high and then never happened again. Now, I don't tend to point to those days. My data doesn't actually contain them. These graphs don't show individual days. I'm always averaging stuff and figuring out growth rates and so on. But I will say that there's a very good chance that Stanislaus had one very high day. Maybe it was due to a change in reporting, but maybe it was just due to an error in data entry. Let's hope that's true. These two, Marin and Kern, also I'm wondering whether there was either a single day spike due to a change in reporting or an error in data entry. I could remove those if I can confirm that it's an error in data entry. Kernel Data Scraper will probably also remove them, but it may also just be that they changed the way they reported things. And so that day has a lot of historical data packed into it. So if we take out those outliers, we get what I think is a probably more realistic picture of the growth rate of California right now. And it looks fairly good. This worst one here, Madera, is actually better than it used to be. So it's also trending downward, though you can't tell. And I say also because all of these are trending downward, with very few exceptions. We finally had, Imperial's been looking good for a long time now in growth rate. We finally had Orange, our first county, cross zero. Orange seems to be turning the corner. You can see it's literally orange on this graph, or orangey brown. Heading downward for a long time now from a very troublesome peak at 75% growth rate. It has headed downward and reached a point of, really we can say recovery. We can almost use the word recovery when someone crosses zero. This is Orange turning the corner towards recovery. And here are all these other counties mostly seeming to head downward. We had a lot of worse stuff back in the day. All of these counties now getting better. Now, note of caution, it could be that they're getting better while a whole bunch of other counties are getting worse. Yeah, these are the ones that have them. This is the DCPM hottest counties. So these are the hottest counties in total cases. So yeah, that could be the case. That just could be, again, regression towards the mean, where when something's way high, it tends to go down. We should be able to see a sense of that by looking at this graph, however, because this shows all the counties, and it's really hard to read because it shows all the counties. But from far away, it does appear that there are a lot of counties that were bad now that have gotten better. There's this one we've talked about, Stanislaus, which had one weirdly, absurdly high day, so possibly just an error in the data. We have Mendocino, which was probably, that's not just a spike, so maybe a little more legit, but also recovering. And then we have Kern and Marin shooting upwards. Do we see a general recovery in California? Well, yes, in growth rate. Surely, I don't think that can be easily argued. There's a real packing of these counties here down below the 40% mark, below the 30% mark, when that just wasn't the case a little bit ago. So California has been growing, and California now seems to be, it's still growing, but it's trending towards less growth. So that's one step removed from where we can say that it's recovering in the way that we can say about Orange or Imperial, but at least we see a trend in that direction. Okay, I think I'm going to stop for the day there. The news is much the same as it's been in recent days, which is a whole lot of bad regions, a lot of severity happening, but trends suggesting that we may be heading into an area where, once these drop below zero, or even severity does already include this, so this number. So even to drop from, say, if Madera drops from 33 to 10, even though it's still growing, it will show up as a much less severe case in the severity report. In terms of the numbers on the ground, the DCPM, the daily cases per million, those won't start to look better until this rope drops below zero as a whole, or at least the middle of it drops below zero. So California, and also the states, and also the countries to a lesser degree, I think, are still pretty bad. We still have a lot of cases. We still have growth of cases. So we're going to keep seeing those case numbers rising, but we still see, over many weeks now, an indication that we are headed toward that point where we could say something is recovering. It's a step removed from the happy place of negative growth, and two steps removed from the happy place of zero cases, a very happy place of zero cases, but at least 2 steps away, we can start to see the light at the end of the tunnel for California and for the country. That's what I'm seeing here when I look at these graphs anyway. That's the news. I'm Greg Farrar. I tend to do a blog every 2 days. Well, every 4 days I do a live stream like this. So probably about 4 days from now, I'll do another, unless something really dramatic happens and I feel the sudden urge to do another. Anyway, about 4 days from now, I'll do one of these, and about 2 days from now, I'll post another blog. That's how it's been happening. And there certainly is enough news to support that continuing to happen. If you like these, tell other people, especially if you see people in the pit of despair over looking at the daily cases graphs. Say, well, there is another way to look at this. There's this website, gregfarrar.us, keeps showing that we are trending in a good direction of the growth level, and so maybe we don't have to despair. Maybe we really are headed into a better place. If you like it, also look at my YouTube, look at my live streams and like them, and subscribe and tell people about them. Tell them about my website, tell them about my blog. I would love to see more people exposed to this, because it is a different voice. I'm speaking in a different voice from the mainstream media. The mainstream media mostly is talking about how terrible the numbers are, that they're going up every day. And I'm saying, yes, that's true. The numbers are terrible and they're going every day. And we're seeing growth trending downward. That's the news. Thanks for watching.